Hello, and welcome to the LeaseDefend podcast. I am your host, Art Veal. Today, we're going to be discussing a subject that I spend most of my time on. And we're going to be discussing some of the best tools and things to look out for when screening tenants. If you've heard it in my previous podcast, then you know that screening tenants is the first and best defense to having a very easy to manage and headache free property management system. I'm a big proponent of screening tenants properly because after years and years of going through all kinds of horror stories, I came to realize that the way that I screened my tenants was the number one factor in how good of a tenant I got, and how long they stayed, and how much or how little of a headache they gave me. Um, it took me years to figure that out. And so if I can help anybody to avoid the years of frustration that I went through and some of the headaches, then I'm more than happy to do that. Um, it's almost like if the way I look at it is you spend for every 20 minutes, maybe you spend screening a tenant and looking for the right red flags or the right things about a tenant. That will save you days, hours, days, weeks of headache in the long run through the rental experience. So I want to jump right in here and talk about what I primarily do to screen tenants. I uh, started off screening tenants the way everyone else does. I ran a background check that included a credit check and a criminal history check. And I had some success with it where, the tenants would be okay, but I had a lot more times when the tenant was not okay. They would have all kinds of financial issues that would cause a headache for me. They would have sometimes, I've never had a problem with a criminal situation with the tenant, but I've had financial issues with tenants. I've had tenants that have just been difficult to deal with. And I'm going to discuss the things that I do now to screen tenants. And the way I screen tenants now, um, I have I have not had an eviction since I started screening tenants this way. I've only had one non-paying or slow-paying tenant, I should say, in the three years that I've been screening tenants this way. So I think it's a much better way to screen tenants, and it's literally a part of my management and the way I manage. So there are two areas that I look at whenever an applicant comes in to my screening process. Um, the first area that I look in is stability. I want to see how stable they are as a person, financially and emotionally and mentally, and even with their family, how stable they are. I've had a lot of problems in the past with people that, and I don't. Let me be clear on the type of tenant that I deal with. I deal with lower income tenants. They're not usually subsidized housing, but they're paycheck to paycheck type tenants. Average income is 50 to 60,000 a year, so not very high income, but you know, uh, I guess lower middle class maybe, or upper lower class. I guess you would look at it. I don't want to, that's the way I look at it. And so I'm always looking for the stability. That's a big plus with me. If I can show that someone's stable, and I'll show what I do to look at their stability. And then, because one of the things you want to avoid is the stability of a woman or even a man that their family life isn't stable. So they have, girlfriends in and out. They're constantly, uh, you know, it's me and my fiance, because nobody's a boyfriend and girlfriend when they're getting a rental. Everybody's a fiance. And they'll say, that me and my fiance are renting. And then 2 weeks after the rental starts, they say, well, he or she moved out and now it's just me and I can't afford this place as much, but I'm going to try to make it work. So you want to look for the stability of the tenant. And then you also want to look at the quality of the tenant. And so I'm going to go through the steps that I do to ensure that I can see the stability and the quality of an applicant when they come through my process. So there's a couple of things I look at as far as stability. There are five things. The first thing I look at is probably the most obvious, and I look to check if they have an eviction record. Now, I'm in Illinois, so we can check public record to see if someone's had an eviction filed in their name. I'm not interested in if they've completed an eviction. In other words, if they've gone through the entire eviction process. Although, if I do see that, that is kind of a red flag. But I want to see if they've ever had an eviction filed for on them. A lot of people, when you ask them if they've ever had an eviction, they'll say no, and you'll check, and they've had one filed on them, and then they'll say, "Well, I never knew about it," and that's usually because they moved out of the property before the sheriff served them papers or anything like that. They just moved out, but that doesn't excuse the fact that they probably still owe somebody money, and that person just did not pursue it. So I always check to see if I can see any public record if they filed eviction on that person. Now, here in Illinois, it's a disclosure state, so that's public record, so we can see that um, by doing a simple check with the county in Illinois to see if they've had any evictions. But depending on where you're at, you might have to use a service. I'll give you my recommendation for a service at the end of this podcast, but that's the first thing I look for. The next thing I look for is proof of income, and I couple that with source of income. I like to see how they're getting paid and proof that they are getting paid. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this. I use a service personally, um, but in fact, I use the LeaseDefend service because the LeaseDefend service can verify income, at least the income that goes into a bank account. But I'm always looking at their proof of income, which is paycheck stubs or a printout history from their job. I rely, like I said, primarily on the LeaseDefend screening tool to verify the income they put into a bank statement. Um, and I also look at their source of income because some people come to me and they have a good income, but it turns out that they're a mechanic or they own a daycare or they get SSI, and nothing's wrong with any of those, but I need to see consistency, and I need to see that they're getting income on a consistent basis, which gives them stability. Again, with the LeaseDefend product, I can see how often they get paid over the last 6 months, how much they're bringing into their account, and how that money is coming into the account. So it's a great tool that answers that question for me. But any way you do it is fine. I'm a little bit leery of paycheck stubs. I've had people in the past that have given me falsified paycheck stubs. I've even had people that took, let's say, a friend's paycheck stub and basically printed out a little sticker or printed out a little name with their name and address, and then covered up the original name and then copied that. And so they forged a paycheck from someone else, and they actually didn't work there. So one of the things you can do if you're not using a service is you can verify that paycheck with their job. Now, one of the things when you verify the paycheck with the job, never call the number that they give you and never call the number on the paycheck. Do a Google search for the place that they work and call the number that's on the Google search. And the reason for that is I've even had to deal with tenants that have bought a burner phone, meaning a temporary phone, and they'll put the phone number to that temporary phone as the number for their job. And then when I call that number, their friend or their mother or somebody like that answers the phone and says, yes, I can verify the employment for that person. And I know that sounds crazy, but some people are desperate to do whatever they can to get into a place. The next thing I look at is their spending habits or their amount of debt that they're carrying. Now, this isn't always easy to come by. Like I said, I use the LeaseDefend service, which can verify everything that goes through their bank account, which is a very good tool to do that. But you usually can verify spending habits. One, I'll ask them, I'll say, how many debts do you pay outside of your regular utility payments? How many credit cards do you carry? How much do you pay to those credit cards, that kind of thing? I do all of that in my application process. So I do it early on, and I can kind of get an idea of if they're kind of out of control with their spending or if they have, relatively controlled spending. And that's before I use the service, but that's a way to do it manually. Next, I look at the length of their last rental. So I get some people that come to me and they're moving from one place, and I say, well, how long were you at the previous place? And they'll say, well, I was only there for 4 months. Well, that's an immediate red flag. Why were you only there 4 months? And they come out with some kind of story about how they thought the place was better than it was, and it's not, and it's got a lot of problems. Well, that's fine in some cases, but um, a lot of times that could be because they tried to play games with that landlord, and that landlord didn't, play the games, and so they're already starting an eviction or about to start an eviction. So they're trying to line up their next place. The way to protect against length of last rental is, it doesn't necessarily have to be the red flag that would stop me from dealing with that person. But typically, when you have a person that's not stable, they'll have more than one red flag. And one of the red flags I look for is how long they stayed at their previous place. I like to see people that have stayed in their previous place at least 2 years, unless they have a compelling reason why they had to move, like a relocation for a job, or, a sick relative that they had to move out of state for, or something like that. And the last thing for stability, I look for the length of employment. Now, I don't have to see the length of their employment with a particular work company, but I do like to see the length of their employment in the same field. So if they're a truck driver, which I get a lot of truck drivers, I'll say, how long have you been working with this company? And they'll say, well, I've only been there for 9 months. And I'll say, okay, well, how long have you been a truck driver? And they'll say, well, I've been a truck driver for the last 14 years, and I've just moved around companies. And I understand that happens. The same thing happens with nurses, where they'll switch companies and switch jobs. And I'm okay with that. And I'll usually ask, between your last job, did you have any off time? And if they say they did, then that might be a red flag. But most of the time, when they're in the same industry, they usually don't have any off time between the two jobs. So looking at those 5 things, that's what I look at for the stability of a tenant. Now, on the quality of a tenant, I actually do an old school maneuver, and I contact their last landlord. Now, you'll hear all kinds of stories about why you should not contact their last landlord. But what I've found is that if you get in touch with their last landlord, a lot of times, even if the reason people say don't get in touch with the last landlord is because, let's say they're a bad tenant, that landlord might tell you anything and everything just to get them out of their place and get them moving on to someplace else. But if you ask enough questions, even if they're a bad tenant and the landlord is lying, a lot of times a little bit of the truth will come out, and anything that's inconsistent or that doesn't match up to me when I talk to the last landlord is a red flag. So some of the questions I'll typically ask the last landlord, I'll ask them to verify the address that that person is staying in. I'll ask them to verify how long the person has been in that address, and I ask the tenant or the applicant how long they've been at their current address before I talk to the landlord. That way, I can make sure that matches up. I'll ask how much their rental amount is, how much they were paying in rent, and verify that amount with what I asked the tenant in my application. Next, I'll ask about their pay history. Were they ever late? Did they ever miss payments? I'll also ask if they ever bounced a check. Did they ever do an NSF check? And then finally, I'll ask if they had any damage to the property, or did they do any damage to the property since they've been there. Now, like I said, usually the person, the reason I ask so many questions of the previous landlord is I've had people that, again, got a burner phone and had their friend act as their previous landlord. And if you ask a lot of questions, they might verify 1 or 2 things that their friend told them to verify. But a lot of times they don't know all of these questions. So they'll stutter and kind of dance around the question and things like that. Like they might not remember the exact address, or they might not remember how long their friend told them to tell you, or sometimes they'll get the rent amount wrong, that kind of thing. So I always ask a couple of questions of that previous landlord. Usually going through this process, I get a very good quality tenant. The other thing that people don't talk about with tenant screening is you have to properly market your rental to have an overflow of tenants. If you've only got one person in the pipeline and you really need to get that rental filled, it's going to make it really hard to make a good decision on whether or not to rent them, because when one red flag comes up, you'll say, oh, well, that's not too bad. They're still good. And then 2 or 3 or 4 red flags will come up, and you'll say, this could be risky, but I really need to get this place rented, and I'll take the chance. So if you have a pipeline with a lot of tenants in the pipeline, you're more likely to make a sensible decision as far as who you rent to. So looking at this information, like I said, I tip personally used the LeaseDefend product just because, not because I was, I'm part of LeaseDefend, but I use it because it works and it's a better way to screen tenants. A quick story: I had a applicant that came in, and I do rent to own, so we require a larger down payment, which is a part of our screening process. But this person came in, they said they had their money together for the down payment, and I ran the LeaseDefend report on them, and I saw that they carried about, last month they had about 9 NSFs on their account, where their account was overdraft. I saw that they had several payments on utility bills where they paid, let's say in January, then they didn't pay in February or March, but then they paid in April. Or they had rent payments where they paid, instead of paying, they told me their rent payment was $1,000, for example. And I saw that based on my LeaseDefend report that they paid different amounts each month, which meant usually that they're paying sporadically or they're piecemealing their rent to the landlord. So it allowed me to avoid a tenant that kind of looked good at first sight, but after getting more information, I saw that they were a risky tenant and did not take on that risk. And that probably saved me thousands of dollars in headache. And so it's well worth it to screen your tenants. So I hope these tools are giving you some thoughts and giving you some ideas on how to screen your tenant, or the questions you might want to ask when you're screening your tenant. Join me on the next podcast. I'm going to discuss my entire screening process from start to finish, and you'll see why the process builds up to screen the tenant. Even before they get to see the house, we screen tenants. And so I'll be discussing that. So I look forward to talking with you. If you have questions or comments, or maybe you have something unique that you do in your tenant screening process, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment in the section below, and I'll be sure to respond. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon. I look forward to speaking with you on the next podcast. This has been Art Veal with the LeaseDefend podcast, and I wish you the best. Have a great day. Goodbye.